Right, I think perhaps we should get started because we're at a tight timetable for this event. As I say, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Mark Steers. I am the director of the Sydney Policy Lab here at the University of Sydney, and I'm your host and chair for this fabulous discussion this morning, launching the wonderful book, Non-Profits in Policy Advocacy. I'll say a little bit about the book and about what it's trying to do and about this session in a moment. But before that, I do just want to acknowledge that I am coming from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, here in what is now called Sydney, New South Wales. I want to pay deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today, and to recognise, as we always do here at the lab, that the land that our building stands upon was never ceded from the First Nation people who lived here for thousands of years and pursued great learning on this site. It's wonderful to be able to host this session. It's an extraordinarily timely discussion, as I'm sure you're all aware. You don't need me to tell you that. During the pandemic over the last few months, non-profit organizations, civil society organizations have been at the forefront of policy advocacy all across the world, pushing for the most remarkable innovations in public policy that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime. But of course, the advocacy strategies that they have been deploying now have long roots, have been developed over many decades and many sort of moments of reflection, opportunity and challenge. And if you like, what the book shows us is that there's a sort of repertoire of advocacy approaches available to any nonprofit at any moment in time. And one of the things that we're going to be examining and asking about are, of course, the pros and cons of those different approaches, the ways in which they're selected by different kinds of nonprofits at different moments in time. And of course, given the international nature of our discussion today, the way that some strategies emerge in some locations and travel or don't travel to different kinds of locations. We're going to proceed in a relatively straightforward fashion. Sheldon and Amy are going to give us an overview of the book, of what motivated them to do the research, of what the fundamental findings are. And then we're going to have a remarkably, we're blessed to be joined by Jessica Gunderson and Dr. Mark Toney, who are going to describe some of their experiences on the ground, the case studies that appear in the book, and give us some reflections from the perspectives of practitioners and reflectors on the nature of advocacy. As you listen, I invite you to share any questions and comments and reflections in the chat. That's the way that I will later on sort of make sure that we have a discussion, a Q&A discussion. So feel free at all times to type your thoughts in. I'll try and keep my eagle eye on the chat. And then when we get to a Q&A, the last 15 minutes of our session today, I will read your questions out to the panelists and hopefully we'll be able to have a free-flowing discussion, Australia, the United States, all the various practitioners and scholars who have joined us today. But with no further ado, you haven't come here to listen to me. I'm going to hand over to Amy and Sheldon.
Great, thank you, Mark. We really appreciate it. I'm going to start off. My name is Sheldon Jan. I'm a faculty member at San Francisco State University. I want to thank everybody who's joining us on our book launch. So I want to briefly describe what started this research agenda and this book idea, because it kind of conveys the kind of information that you will find in the book. And then Amy will talk about our methods. I know we have a lot of academic folks online, and so you'll be interested in that. And then we'll spend time just in a broad overview of the main findings that we found about strategies that nonprofit organizations use to affect policy. So let me explain our motivation. And I have to take you back to 2008 in California. Californians in that year were in the middle of a raging debate and battle about the legality of same-sex marriage in the state. This battle was following many local efforts to both expand marriage rights as well as to restrict it. And so what happened in 2008 was a group together put on the ballot an initiative called Proposition 8, which was proposed to be a constitutional amendment that would declare marriage as only between a man and a woman in the state of California. And this blew up into a giant campaign. It was the most expensive proposition in the history of California, in the 100-year history of propositions in California. Over $70 million were spent on both sides of the campaign. And the issue attracted over 80% of registered voters to show up at the polls and cast their vote on this issue, which is another record. At the end of the voting, the proposition won 52% to 48%. And at that time, I was a relatively new assistant professor at San Francisco State and studying public policy. And so the drama and the tension of this issue drew my attention. And I remember watching the news coverage of this event in 2008. And of course, when they covered the Yes on 8 campaign, we saw smiling faces, people celebrating, talking about the victory of traditional family values, and they were, proud of the fact that it was a constitutional amendment, so that seemingly this was a permanent decision for the state of California. And then the news would pan over to the No on 8 campaign, and this is what surprised me. Because if I had turned off the volume on the television and just watched the expressions that I saw on the screen, I would have thought that they had won. But instead, I listened to what they were saying, and what they were saying were things like, we lost this battle, but it's really clear to us we are about to win the war. And what they were talking about was the fact that 48% of Californians had voted against the proposition, which was the largest support for marriage equality that the state had ever seen. And these advocates were projecting the trend that they'd seen over the prior few years. And they said, we see the crest in this war on the horizon, and we think we're on our way to winning. So that led me as a policy scholar to wonder things like, how do advocates view the process of policy change, and what are their measures of progress and success that allows them to know that they're being effective even in a multi-year drawn out battle? And what are the tactics that they use, and how do they combine those tactics into comprehensive strategies for policy change? That same year, Amy was recently hired in San Francisco State, brand new from UC Berkeley. And she and I had already connected because we have a common interest in policy studies and policy issues. And on our campus, we had started what we humbly called the Public Policy Research Group. We're not marketeers, we're academics, so we couldn't come up with a better title, but it was descriptive of what we were. We were about 20 or so professors in San Francisco, spread across all different kinds of disciplines, but having a common interest in policy relevant studies. And we landed some grant support to support our research. And so we met regularly to develop each other's agendas and to help each other out with our research. After Prop 8, Amy and I decided we need to start our own agenda that investigates these questions about policy advocacy, tactics being used, strategies that are formulated from them, and how nonprofits know if they're on track towards ultimate policy victory in these drawn out battles. And so we started a research agenda that led us to collect a ton of information and data, which Amy will describe shortly. But for now, I want to say, in the process of collecting these data, many of these policy advocates told us their stories of defeats and victories. And these are stories that held a lot of drama, and stories that several of the advocates explicitly told us, we want our story told to the public because we think there's something to be learned from our experiences. And these stories weren't making it into the journal articles that we were writing. And so we decided we're going to save up all these stories and put them into a book form. And that's what led to our book that we're talking about today, which includes over a dozen case studies of policy advocacy campaigns that cover a wide range of issues, from civil rights to criminal justice, education, energy, environment, public health, public infrastructure, and youth. And so that gives you an understanding of how we came upon this topic. Amy, you want to talk a little bit about our methods?
Yes, and I just wanted to, just to recognize this has been 10 years or more in the making. So it's just really exciting to actually hold your physical book and to be able to launch the book with two of our advocates, with new colleagues in Australia, and to see also old friends and colleagues who've registered for this event. So hello to folks that are in the US and Australia. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so I'll share a little bit about how we went about doing this research. So the research approach that we took, as Sheldon said, the origin of this came from being really curious about what advocates do in terms of how they envision change, this pathway to change. And part of that also came because Sheldon and I were training people to be advocates, in public administration and in my department in child development. So we wanted to figure out how do we prepare people to do that kind of work. So we did a piece of work, and this was our first publication together, where we found and synthesized logic models about the process of advocacy, and sort of identified what the kind of boiled it down to the basics. We also then looked at theories that linked the kind of elements of the logic model, actually linked the inputs to the activities and then to the outcomes in terms of how you might move, particularly from the activities to the outcomes in terms of what you would expect by doing X that you might achieve Y. And that informed the use of Q methodology, which was something that Sheldon came up with that I was unfamiliar with, but it's a particular methodology that can be used to look at viewpoints, and it's analyzed using a type of factor analysis that identifies clusters of viewpoints. And we used this synthesis process to come up with statements that would characterize how people saw the relationships between activities and outcomes. And then that prepared us to go out and do empirical research. So that's where we did interviews, and the Q methodology approach is called Q sorts, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, with a group of policy advocates, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a real hotbed of activism, and a lot of the kind of ideas and approaches of doing advocacy can really originate in San Francisco. So it was a great place to do our research. That led us to also doing a national survey to see how characteristic these strategies were, looking across the country. And then coupling, we sort of using our interviews as a launching point, we did some archival analysis to look at the materials that came out of those policy campaigns that were identified by our advocates like Mark and Jessica. We sort of went and dug up the records and newspaper articles, et cetera, that we could find. So I'll elaborate a little bit more on each of those steps, not to go into detail and all these kinds of words, but this was the process that we walked through. So this was the logic model that we assembled from the practitioner logic models that we found, which came from some foundations and also large advocacy organizations. And those are reported in our first article together, and they're also described in the book. So those logic models identify that you need certain things, first of all, as an advocacy organization. So you need to feel that you can make a change in the policy process. You need to have people who are your staff members or your volunteers and your board, and relationships with people, for your constituency and people in power, and certain types of specialized knowledge and skills, depending on what people were planning to undertake, as well as material resources, which include, importantly, financial resources. And that prepares people to do certain activities. So those activities include coalition building, methods of engaging and mobilizing the public, ways of building relationships with decision makers, getting information out there through the media and information campaigning, reform efforts, which can include pilots to sort of demonstrate that something could be done on a small scale, and defensive activities, which are kind of reactive to try to protect policies or approaches, as well as people who are willing to look carefully at the details when, after the policy is made and how it actually gets implemented in the policy monitoring process. And we did find that it's not just policy change that people are after. It's also that along the path to policy adoption, they're looking for shorter term changes. So as the example pointed out that Sheldon mentioned, they're looking for changes in public views and decision makers' views, because that can lead ultimately to a change in policy. So, and this is a very dense slide, so I won't go into this, but these are the types of theories that basically that we identified that relate, that kind of connect the activities to the outcomes that we looked at. So we drew across a diverse range of theory. You know, we sort of looked at political science theories and policy studies theories primarily, and found that these theories sort of supported that, you know, again, if you do X, you might kind of arrive at Y in terms of an outcome. So we described this also in our first paper, the types of theories that would support our hypothesized strategies. And that combination really of the theory and the logic model helped us to develop some statements. So this is what I referred to earlier as a concourse, these cards. These are messages that we developed that came from that piece of research. And we asked people to sort these cards. And so we did interviews with 31 policy advocates, primarily in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also some in Sacramento, California, and also some in Washington, DC. And we asked them to say, you know, looking at these cards, sort them in terms of whether this most fits what you do in your agency or your nonprofit organization, or least fits. And they sort of did the activity, as you can see in the corner. And using that data, we then analyzed that data to distill down distinct strategies that people were engaging in. And the strategies look like this. And this is something that Sheldon's going to elaborate on, so I won't talk about it now. But it basically combined types of activities to types of outcomes people were seeking, and came into these 6 distinct types of strategies. And again, this analysis that's done is a type of factor analysis, and whereby we kind of empirically derived these strategies. We use that information also to sort of test, you know, are these strategies only for the San Francisco Bay Area, or are they kind of nationally representative? So we did an online survey in 2014 using GuideStar, which is a database for nonprofit organizations in the United States. And there's a kind of way that organizations self-identify, and they can self-identify as being an advocacy organization in terms of the code they apply to themselves. So we derived kind of a group, we derived the organizations that self-identified as advocacy organizations, and then we randomly sampled those organizations and sent invitations for them to complete this national survey. And we had a pretty good response rate with 37% and 811 responses. And you can see that we got them sort of across the country, of course, clustering up where you see the population centers and also the centers of advocacy activities in places like Washington, DC, and Boston and New York, as well as parts of California and Seattle. And that's also what we report on in the book. So we talk about in the book the types of organizations that use these strategies. Are they large organizations? Are they small organizations? Are they volunteer run? Is there an association between a strategy and a sort of area of advocacy, like civil rights, for example? So we report on that data as well in the book. And the other thing that we report on in the book is the really rich stories that we came up with, these strategies that came from the interviews with our advocates. So these are just some of the case studies, some of the organizations that are represented in our book in these sort of case studies. So these are the interviews that we did, and they tell different stories in relation to the strategies that they use. So most chapters have 2 or 3 stories that kind of bring alive the strategies that Sheldon will now describe to you.
So this slide essentially gives you a summary of the main findings from our research and reported in this book. And we have a chapter devoted to each one of these strategies. So the slide represents the 6 strategies that we identified in all the data that we collected. And we described them in the book along a continuum, and it's represented in this chart as well. The continuum runs from top to bottom in this slide. And on one end of the continuum are strategies that focus on influencing the so-called formal players in the policy process, that is, elected officials or government agencies, and with little effort in public engagement. And so on the top of this, that top strategy, public lobbying strategy, focuses mainly on lobbying formal players in the process and relatively little public engagement. And the bottom is the exact opposite. The popular power strategy represents one that focuses on influencing the general public with very little engagement of the formal players. And in between are varied combinations of engaging formal and informal players in the policy process, and doing so in different ways based upon how they see the process of policy change. And so I won't go in detail with all six. I'm just going to highlight the top and the bottom and one in the middle, just so you get a sense of how varied these strategies are. And then we're going to hear from a couple of our advocates to tell you about their campaigns. So as I mentioned, on the top of this list is the public lobbying strategy. And this one uses tactics that are most associated with commercial lobbying, and that is personal relationships with legislators and executives and official players. But most of these advocates don't use money as their primary source of influence with these folks, as you might see in the commercial lobbying. Rather, it's expertise and education. And these advocates really see themselves as trustees of the public interest, and they often represent either constituencies that lack political voice, foster youth, the incarcerated, or public interests that are very complicated and often beyond the knowledge of the average citizen. And so they see themselves as working on behalf of the public interest, even when that public isn't engaged in their strategy. And then on the other end, the power strategy is the one that we're seeing a lot of coverage on in the United States today, with the Black Lives Matters movement, and before that, the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is a strategy that focuses on engaging the public, bringing out the public's voice and energy in very visible ways, with very little interaction with the formal players. And their rationale behind it is, if you can get the public show of sustained support, the rest will follow. The formal players will follow. And so their energies are focused on just mobilizing that public show of preference and power. And in the middle, again, are different combinations of each. I just want to highlight one so you can get a flavor for what you'll find in these middle strategies. I want to highlight the direct reform strategy, in that it combines both interactions with the formal players and engagement with informal players. On the formal side, these are advocates who try to change policy outside of the legislative process, either through judicial action or administrative action. And the most visibly common one that you might be familiar with is litigation. And so using the judiciary in a lawsuit to bring about broader social changes in how the government works. And so in our book, we report advocates who, for example, are shutting down coal-fired energy plants through the lawsuit. And so in others, there's a very dramatic story told in our book about a lawyer who is largely responsible for, not solely responsible, but he built up the momentum that ultimately led to a ban on trans fats in our processed foods in the United States. And the way he did it, or the way he started that snowball rolling, was suing Nabisco over Oreo cookies on behalf of children, which sounds outlandish, but trans fats are banned now in the United States processed foods. But what really I find interesting about this strategy, which I was not expecting as a researcher, but came out clearly in the data, was that these advocates don't just stay in the courtroom. And so in those two cases that I talked about, coal-fired power plants and Oreos, they combined their lawsuit with a public information campaign. And this is the part that surprised me. And this is the engagement with the public part of this strategy that shows the mix of the two. They told us that the judiciary is not apolitical, is not isolated. They pay attention to what's going on in the public too. And so these advocates paid a lot of attention to making sure that the public saw their lawsuits and understood the issues that are at stake from their lawsuits. And so that was a key tactic that was a part of this strategy of direct reform. So that gives us an overview of the whole book. I want to turn it over now to two of our guests who are advocates that are profiled in our book. And I'm so glad to have them both here. We're going to start with Jessica Gunderson, who is a consultant with Partnership for Children and Youth. And I'll have her introduce that organization to you and the campaign she managed that's reflected in our book. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks for having me. And Amy, we can move it to the next slide. Good afternoon or morning. I'm here in sunny California with blue skies, which we're very grateful for and blessed to have. Again, my name is Jessica Gunderson. I was a policy director at the Partnership for Children and Youth, which I'm going to use the acronym PCY because it wouldn't be an educational issue if you didn't use a lot of acronyms, as many of you know, in the policy space. The Partnership for Children and Youth is both an advocacy and capacity building organization that's really focused on educational justice. It's really about providing equitable learning opportunities for all kids in the state of California. And I want to highlight this because it's very relevant in the book, is the types of organizations. So what's unique about PCY is it's known as an intermediary organization. And if you haven't heard that term, I would say it's a bridge between policy and practice. So we are not a direct service provider, but our clients are the direct service providers. So we're serving all the adults that are serving kids and families directly. So half of my organization is practitioners, have direct service experience, and then half is comms and advocacy. So that really suits kind of the institutional partnership model, which I'll discuss. And just a little bit more about myself. I've been working in policy and advocacy for about 15 years in the state of California. I also had a stint in New York. And I did purchase the book, and I will just say two things. One, it's so grounded in real world experience. And it was exciting to see my own professional trajectory and how my logic model for social and political change is manifested, and really see it reflected in the book. So that was exciting. So we can go on to the next slide. So let's start off the why. What was the problem our campaign was seeking to address? And if you don't work in educational policy, you might not have heard this term, but basically in the mid to late 2000s, some research emerged primarily out of Johns Hopkins, which pointed to the fact that 2/3 of the achievement gap, and that is the disparity in educational outcomes between low income and higher income, their higher income peers, 2/3 of that gap is attributed to the differences in learning experiences in the summer. And so that's what this graph is showing. Each year, the gaps get bigger based on the differences in summer experiences between low income young people and their more affluent counterparts. And so if you want to address educational equity, you cannot do that without systematically addressing what's happening during the summer. So that leads us to the Summer Matters campaign. You can move the next slide. This campaign was launched in 2009. It was a 7-year campaign, which is another essential piece, right? How long is your campaign going to be running? This was a longer term campaign that was invested and seeded by the David Lucille Packard Foundation. I want to mention them only because there are a lot of policy wonks on the phone. They have some great policy evaluations on their website that look at large scale campaigns over decades. So it's pretty fascinating. PCY was the organization that oversaw the campaign, but really there was a whole infrastructure of dozens of organizations with all different types of expertise that were being funded. So this was basically a massive multi-year campaign that really had all kinds of elements from the book, but I'm going to focus on something that made, I would say, our campaign quite unique. And at the end of the day, what were we trying to do? We were trying to ensure that every child had access to a high quality learning, summer learning opportunity. So we can move on to the next slide. So I'm not going to have a chance again to go into all of the strategies that we used, but I think you can see here in both the strategies outlined in the slide and the principles, some common themes that you saw in institutional partnerships. So what does that mean? One, we were building off existing infrastructure. We were not trying to blow up the boxes. We were saying, what does California do right? Where are resources now? Where is the infrastructure? And then build from that, right? So it's very much an asset-based approach when you think about partnering with government. That being said, even though we were building off older systems, we were trying to change a paradigm shift in how people thought. Typically, when people think about summer, they think of summer school as a punitive and remedial model. And what we were trying to focus on, again, is a blended learning model. So we wanted a camp-like experience. So for all those families that have resources and money, they don't stick their child in a punitive, dark classroom all summer. They get accesses to all kinds of learning and enriching supports, and that's what all kids deserve. And we had an equity focus, which I already mentioned. And then on the campaign strategy, kind of three big buckets. I'm going to focus on our work around developing demonstration and pilot sites and how that informed our statewide campaign. But we were also trying to build public awareness as well as policymaker, and then running bills and changing law basically every year. So we can move on to the next slide. And so I'm going to focus on what we had was basically 12 pilot site communities. And these were more than just sites. There wasn't just one school. These were entire communities. And they were strategically chosen based on to represent the diversity of California. And this is essential for many reasons, right? One, politically, right? You're going to get a much more diverse cross-section of kind of political champions. Two, your research base is going to be able to be proof points in different areas. Three, in California, local control really with all issues is essential to long-term success, but particularly education. So you needed these models to be adaptable for different needs and communities and with ownership from the local leaders. What you have here also is there was kind of a whole set of like criteria for how we chose the pilot sites, as well as agreements that they had to make. And so each received a grant, but they also had a lot of technical assistance. And that was both, the TA was both developing the high quality programming we wanted to see, as well as building their advocacy and communications components. And so I'm not going to go through all these key components, but what I will say about the demonstration sites is that really they had a shared vision of what summer learning was. And so we could point out consistently, these are the 10 principles that you need, or these are the 10 elements. And those were then able to influence policy change. So as you'll see here is that we basically were operating 12 micro campaigns that all moved up into a giant statewide campaign. So it was this top down, bottom up kind of feedback loop. And also we were able to kind of have proof points on the ground. So anyone that does policymaking knows that there is nothing more compelling than a good site visit. And we had thousands and thousands of site visits for political leaders, for legislators, for the whole gamut. And that is when you will get people to put their money where their mouth is or change policy. And then lastly, this provided a natural infrastructure for advocacy and communications, right? So it galvanized hundreds of thousands of people that were then able to put pressure, whether it's federal or state or local. And last is this champion building. For us, we were kind of trying to get all these leaders, either mayors, superintendents, principals, or legislators to kind of sign a pledge of what summer learning would look like. And so we were infiltrating a lot of education organizations to try to get them to adopt kind of our view of summer learning. So I'm going to stop there because I'm at time, but just thanks for having me, and look forward to any questions at the end.
Thanks, Jessica. And I failed to mention when I introduced you that your case, but it's really clear when you said it, is a representative of the institutional partnership strategy. And I think you've pretty clearly described how that is so. Your nonprofit really partnered with the government to institute these changes in summer opportunities. Thanks, Jessica. And so next up we have Dr. Mark Toney, of the Utility Reform Network, and he's going to share with us his campaign that is an illustration of the public lobbying strategy.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to see everybody who's on this seminar. So my name is Mark Toney. I serve as Executive Director of TURN, the Utility Reform Network. We're an organization of attorneys, community organizers, lobbyists, and communication specialists who fight for utility customers to get the best service at the lowest prices, to get the most green for the least green. So I'm here to talk about Proposition 16, which was on the June 8th, 2010 ballot in California. And the biggest utility company in California, PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, put this on the ballot. They called it the Taxpayer Right to Vote Act. And it would require public power to receive 2/3 vote to serve new customers in any territory. It gave competitive advantage to a single corporation. So this is about how David can defeat Goliath. Now, Goliath started out with all the advantages granted by power. 16 million customers in Northern California. They had bottomless pockets. I gotta tell you, even in California, $46 million can buy you a lot of TV, radio, print, and billboards. They thought they could buy the election. They had all the support that money could buy. In addition, they were giving out $20 million in charitable contributions to organizations, and they were giving out millions more in campaign giving to elected officials. Now, David started out with a slingshot and 2 nickels. I was the chair of the No on 16 Political Action Committee. We were lucky enough to get Gail Kaufman to volunteer her services. Gail is California's most respected campaign, proposition, ballot initiative campaign consultant. She's the one that the California Nurses Association will pay $1.5 million to run a campaign for or against a proposition, and she did our campaign for free, pro bono, because she believed in it. And so we were able to come up with a winning messaging strategy, that this proposition was for the benefit of a sole funder, that this was about monopoly protection, that PG&E was out of touch and out of control. So because we didn't have resources, we had to rely on the key actor strategy. So we were able to get 26 key elected officials to support the No on 16 campaign, including the California Democratic Party, Congressman John Garamendi, Senate President Darrell Steinberg, and at the time, San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom, who is currently governor of California. We were able to get dozens of civic organizations to endorse No on 16, including AARP, who represents senior citizens, the League of Women Voters, Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, Courage Campaign, Friends Committee, and the California Tax Reform Association. One of the things we decided to do was to undermine the credibility of PG&E because they claimed that they were a coalition that included labor, because they had the support of a single electrical workers union that happened to represent their PG&E workers. So they had one local and said they represent labor. So I said, fine. We did our homework. We got a dozen state and regional labor organizations to endorse no on 16, including the California Labor Federation, the State Building and Construction Trades Council, the Service Employees International State Council, the California Federation of Teachers, the California Nurses Association. So we said, okay, you claim to have labor? Okay, we have more labor. Then they tried to say, well, we represent business. We're endorsed by the California Chamber of Commerce, who of course they pay dues to. We said, fine. So the no on 16, we were endorsed by, and we had to work for these endorsements, the California Association of Realtors, the California Manufacturer and Technology Association, the California Farm Bureau, and we were able to get 10 county chambers of commerce to break ranks with their state body and go no on 16. So it's like, okay, you've got one business representative, we have over a dozen major business representatives. We also won the media editorial support. Remember, they had millions and millions of dollars to buy ads in these newspapers and TV. We were able to get the endorsements for no on 16 of 63 newspapers and media outlets. They got 3 to go yes. Okay, we got LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, the Sacramento Bee, San Diego Union Tribune. We got all of the major media on our side. And so what that meant is what we lacked in money to buy our message was put every organization, every labor union, every elected official, every news outlet became the no on Prop 16 messaging outlet. Never has one company spent so much money to burn so many bridges. PG&E spent $46 million. The no on 16 campaign, we raised and spent about $100,000. And when election day came, Prop 16 lost. Their side only got 48% yes, and we got over 51% no. And so this is an example of how organizations, despite all odds, that it is possible to beat major corporations with unlimited power. I know for turn, this campaign increased our profile as a statewide political power player. It strengthened support for regulation in the public interest, and it weakened the credibility of this corporation that thought they could buy the election, and in fact, that was not true. So I'm gonna stop there because I wanna get to questions too.
That was amazing, Mark. Thank you so much. And thank you to Jessica too. Absolutely fabulous talks. I mean, I hope you get a really strong sense of the book just from listening in for the last 40 minutes, which is this incredibly rich combination of deep theoretical reflection, analyzing the logic models, thinking about how the categories can be drawn, and then these extraordinary stories from the ground of remarkable campaigns using very different strategies, but always having these very compelling stories, often leading to policy successes, which simply couldn't have happened without the non-profit players participating in the full. What I want to do is open it up to questions. We've got a few questions coming in either on the chat function or on the Q&A function on your screen, whichever is best for you, and I'm going to try and pose them. But as those questions come in, let me just ask one opening one to Amy and to Sheldon, which is the relationship between the theory and the practice, which is obviously something which we here at the lab are really interested in. And I guess the cheeky way of putting it is, did any of your case study folks push back and say, you've categorized me in the wrong way, or I don't recognize the logic model that you've described, or, I've gone through your activities, I've done the cards in the order that I thought, but actually now I'm reading it, in black and white, it doesn't sort of resonate with me. And if so, how did you deal with those kinds of conversations?
I'll start, Amy, you can chime in if you want. So the short answer is no, I haven't had any pushback, but the reason behind it is, and I failed to mention this in describing the book, we didn't discover these strategies and then try to put organizations in them. We instead went out to a whole bunch of organizations and tried to distill from their experiences what are the categories, and that's kind of the operations of the Q sort. And so, just as an example with Jessica, it was pure coincidence, and a happy coincidence, that her organization, which is called Partnership for Children and Youth, landed in a strategy that emphasized partnership with government. And I'm sure it wasn't pure coincidence, because that is how they see themselves, is helping out government institutions in the places that they're weak and we're strong. And that's kind of the essence of that strategy. And so, no, we haven't had that. But the other thing that I want to mention is, if you read the book and you really pay attention to the statistics in it, and I'm not prescribing that, but if you do, you'll find that there is no organization that we interviewed that aligned 100% with any one of these strategies. And so the highest score that an organization had was about 0.8, which is, you could think about it as 80% of the variance explained by this strategy. So an alignment, a strong alignment, was the closest. The reality is most of these organizations dabble in more than one of these strategies. But what I think the strategies give us as a community interested in policy change is a way of thinking about the differences in how we approach policy change.
I'll just add to what Sheldon said, is in terms of kind of building this model up from what the advocates do via the Q sort. If we were to do this Q sort methodology again, which I've discussed with some people in the Sydney Policy Lab in Sydney, or more broadly in Australia, we might come up with totally different strategies, and it may well be that some of these connections that we identified from the theory are just not utilized, as they are, in the US. So yeah, I think that's why we kind of let the data kind of guide the strategies in this case. And I wonder, one of the questions too asked for more elaboration on Q methodology. So Sheldon, do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
What was the question?
Sorry. Oh, about Q methodology, how we use Q methodology and what Q methodology achieves.
Oh, well, this is actually a pretty old methodology, but still kind of on the outskirts in social sciences, mainly because it's a really niche methodology that you would only apply in specific circumstances. It's not like surveying or something that has broad application everywhere. And what makes Q methodology applicable, why we thought this was the right methodology for this book and this research project, was its niche is, and how they put it is, it's an objective way of studying subjectivity. And ultimately, Amy and I recognized that what we were studying was advocates' subjectivity about how policy changes. It's a viewpoint. And because a lot of these tactics that we outline, they get packaged differently in these strategies, but a lot of these strategies have largely overlapping tactics. But the difference is how the advocates see those tactics playing a role in policy change. And so that's the reason why we picked Q methodology, and I think it turned out well for us. It would have been a lot different if we just had a giant 12-page survey and sent it out to 1,000 people and then try to analyze it that way. This allowed us to, like I said, to find the categories from the advocates, as opposed to building categories and putting advocates in them.
Fascinating. That's fantastic. I've got a couple more questions for Amy and Sheldon, but I've also got a question here for Jessica and Mark. So if I might do the one for Jessica and Mark first, which is, One of our participants asks about how you evaluate your own success. So, how, what is, in your campaign cycle, what's the moment when you reflect on whether your choice of strategy has turned out to be the right one or not in any particular instance? Do you have formal evaluative processes? Do you bring in independent evaluators? Do you devise sort of theory of change models and sort of analyze them against the experience on the ground? What's your overall approach? That's Jessica. You could start us off.
Sure. We in the case of Summer Matters campaign specifically, because we had the funder at the table and we had a steering committee, it was a much more formalized structure than a lot of campaigns are, which means we had work plans that were being regularly evaluated. They were cross-organizational work plans that were being regularly evaluated on a quarterly basis. And so we were setting goals and outcomes collectively as a group, reporting back, assessing, changing. So it was kind of one, in the field of youth development, continuous improvement in education is like embedded. So it's basically kind of a continuous improvement process. I would just say quickly, most campaigns, I would say, I'm curious what Mark will say, don't often have the evaluation component because there's not time and resources. You just got to go win. But yes, Summer Matters had a very more rigorous check-in and evaluation process.
And driven by the funder in that case? Is that
the funder had a separate evaluator. So like I said, if you look on the website, they had a well-paid evaluation of all aspects of the 6-year campaign. And then we were doing iterative evaluation and kind of process to actually shape the strategy year by year, organization by organization, or quarter by quarter, organization by and adapting.
Fascinating. Mark?
Yes. Because because we don't get external funding, our funding is internally generated through attorney fee reimbursements mostly and our own fundraising. We, whenever we have a major campaign, I do the evaluation. And I basically write something up that serves as the basis of talks, for instance, and the basis of just, trying to figure out what worked really well, what didn't work, what we should do next time. I mean, really, the bottom line for evaluation is, did you win or not? That's it, okay? Did you win? In this case, we won big against huge odds, so it was tremendously successful, but it was still useful to know which pieces of it worked well, which pieces of it didn't. And for instance, one of the things I learned about coalitions is someone has to be in charge of coalitions. Sometimes you make decisions that some people don't like and are upset about, but if you win, people forgive you.
Fantastic, thank you.
And just to add something very briefly, the final chapter in the book actually talks about evaluation, and the complexities of advocacy evaluation compared to program evaluation, where you're looking at, we use this phrase of contribution rather than attribution. And a lot of the methods of evaluation do emphasize what Mark said around how you can learn from a campaign that's successful or not. And also what Jessica said around how you can do this process as you go along rather than wait until the end.
And if I may, just really briefly, when we talked with these advocates, they did convey to us many interim checkpoints besides the ultimate win at the end, because some of them shared stories of defeats, and yet they felt like they were still on track because they can learn from what they missed and still, aim for the change at the end.
Absolutely, fabulous. So I've got a question from Anita, who asks, in the book, this is probably initially for Amy and Sheldon, but then bringing in Jessica and Mark if you want to reflect too. There's a suggestion that some policy campaigns now are sort of swifter, more agile, less institutional. There's sort of flash in the pan or flash mobilizing, grabbing an issue or changing an issue. So a particular debate begins and it gets shifted into a different issue by sort of short-term mobilization. And whether that kind of advocacy strategy whether you came across it, I guess, in your work, whether you see it in your case studies, and whether you think that it is on the rise or not, or whether that's just a sort of artifact of social media, and actually sort of entrenched nonprofit advocacy tends to be longer term, slower, and more institutionalized. So thinking about flash advocacy, I guess, where is it in the book, and where do you think it is in the polity at large?
Do you want to start, Amy? Or
yeah, sure. Well, we looked at nonprofit organizations, not informal actors. So I think academics always like to say we need more research. And I think we probably need more research to look at informal actors rather than formal nonprofit organizations, which is very much the focus for this book.
Yeah. That said, if you think about Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter as a flash, and I'm not saying you should, and I'm not convinced that it is, but it might be in the sense that in the question, is there a formal organization behind this that is organizing it? And frankly, I'm not sure if there is or not, but those activities do reflect the tactics in the popular power strategy, I would say, in the sense that it draws public attention and tries to sustain that and grow it. And so it might fit in that, but Amy's right. We studied nonprofits who are held accountable for their activities, and people want to know, what did you achieve? And so that's a little bit different than purely, flash policy activities like you're talking about.
Fabulous. We're getting close to close. If I could just perhaps put a question and start with Jessica and Mark, and then give Amy and Sheldon a final word. Listening to the stories today, and then of course reading through the book, is actually in a way a hugely sort of optimistic picture. Just listening to the wins that you described this morning, Jessica and Mark, we come away from this space, I think, feeling invigorated by possibility, and sort of, with a big kind of smile about the prospects for democracy. And I guess I've got two issues which come from that. Am I taking away too rosy a picture? Do you basically think that the wins that you've described are, sort of rare or struggles or, sort of against the norm, and that actually most of the time the advocacy strategies described in the book, although they're admirable in many ways, don't work? And a sort of overarching question, I guess, about the health of democracy, and whether you think by thinking about your own experience and also thinking about the other cases in the book, whether you're coming away thinking, actually, despite all of the stuff that we see on the media and all of our anxieties about what happens in November, democracy is in a healthier space, and the opportunities for citizens to influence public policy are as good as we could expect, or at least are good enough for the time being. So, am I taking away an overly optimistic picture by listening to your stories? And what do you think about the health of democracy as a whole after reflecting on what you've read in the book? Mark, perhaps you could kick us off, and then Jessica.
Look, I'm an organizer by trade. I also come from the theory school of thought that sees myself and sees people as historic actors. And so we have no choice. Our struggles are based upon struggles that have happened many years before us and will continue many years after us. So my own position is we fight as hard as we can, as smart as we can, and win as much as we can with the resources we got.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mark. Yes.
Yeah, I would say being in California and being from the Bay Area, I'm surrounded by so many legends and activists. So I would say this book reflects that power, and I believe it has transformed, at least I can only speak for in the US, many of the people in this book, or just like the stories from the book. So, and I would just say, I work with youth. So I'm also, when it comes to democratization and activism, I've never been so inspired in my life, at least the organizations that I worked with. So I would say focusing on youth and young people is where I focus.
Wonderful. Amy, Sheldon, responding to that, but also final thoughts, reflections on what you've heard today, but also, where you think that academic question, as you put it, Amy, where you think we need to go next as researchers and practitioners in understanding nonprofit advocacy.
Well, listening to Jessica and Mark retell their stories, which I've heard in my recordings many times as I'm writing, I was inspired again when I hear their voice telling the story, because these are stories of democracy. I think you're right, Mark. This is, democracy is power of the people. And here we have people who are flexing their power against, in some cases, what seems to be overwhelming opposition, but still getting it done. And the book, you know, does have a lot of drama and interesting cases that are like these. So I'm glad you picked up that vibe, because I hope that that's what readers get from it. Amy, what do you want to add?
And I would just circle back and just say that, you know, again, why we wrote the book was to try to bring together the academic literature and the theory with the practitioner-generated literature, so that the work that advocates do, which is more important now than ever, can be really grounded in what we know from the academic space around the theory and the empirical research. So, you know, we hope that that's the contribution we've made with this book, and that it will be helpful to practitioners, but also to academics who want to do more engaged work and to support the important work of advocacy organizations.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, that I think was a fabulous note to conclude on, because there's much magic in this book, but that integrative function, I think, is crucial to it. I mean, I was chatting last night to a colleague of mine, Danielle Allen at Harvard. Danielle argues that the health of a democracy is its ability to bridge across difference. And one of the ways that you bridge across difference is bringing together scholars and practitioners and integrating the different kinds of experience and wisdom that both have to tell a more powerful story about democracy. And that's definitely what we've done this morning or this afternoon, wherever you come from. I'm trained in the Industrial Areas Foundation community organizing tradition, and the IAF has one primary rule, which is that you start on time and you finish on time. So I'm really proud to be able to report that we've pretty much done that. I want to thank everybody for coming along, for the questions that are in the chat that we hopefully covered. Our sort of virtual doors are always open, so do get in touch with us at the City Policy Lab if you want to continue this debate and discussion. We're very happy to host follow-up discussions. If there are themes that we've come across today that you want to dive into in more depth, just get in touch and we have the capability of doing that. One of the small mercies of this pandemic is it's enabled these kinds of conversations in a way that we probably hadn't anticipated before, and we've learned so much from that. But most of all, I wanted to thank Amy and Sheldon for their book, for describing it so wonderfully today, and for Jessica and Mark for giving us such an inspiration, which gives us a bounce just when we need it, I think. So a huge thanks for all that you do and for the way that you managed to describe it so clearly and excitingly for all of us today. A great pleasure. Thank you, everybody. See you again.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you, everyone. Yes.
Thanks.
It's a pleasure having this conversation.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Mark.